Good morning, everybody, and congratulations, Ned, on this happy birthday party. And you reminded me of one of the good things I luckily stumbled into as I arrived, which is helping you to get this started. You have made us think big and think broadly and think widely, and I hope think wisely for so long that I'm incredibly grateful. And it was an unbelievable treat for me to be able to help you in those early days. You should be sure of that. I wanted to start with this. There was a Festschrift on this, but as I was thinking about today, I was thinking about an early morning, cold morning, November, 48 years ago, when I was a sophomore at Harvard, and I opened this book, which Janet Yellen assigned your chapter, and I read that in Briggs Hall, and I said, I want to be an economist. Wow, that is so exciting. And that was a thrill. This was just mind-blowing for me, what one could learn and think, and it was you, Ned, that made that inspiration. And you've been inspiring us all the way before then and through all the activities of this center. I want to discuss the big question because you asked the big questions, and that is what will be capitalism in the 21st century. And of course, capitalism is a big, loaded word that means vastly different things in different places, so I don't want to spend 30 minutes on semantics, but I do want to argue in the brief remarks that we will have a very different kind of economy, I believe, in the 21st century from the kind of economic life that we have had in the 20th century. That will be true in the United States, and it will be true globally. And the institutional differences will be so different that I think it will be right to describe it when we get there as post-capitalist, and that it will be a global order, as we have a capitalist global order now of a kind, but one that is in rapid transition. The argument is totally functional. We need a different set of institutions, a different way to allocate resources, a different way to share income, a different way to engage in problem solving to face the kinds of problems that we have in the 21st century. And I will mention a number of those problems and why none of them is especially susceptible to the invisible hand. The claim of capitalism is that the invisible hand is, by and large, the right approach because it solves a lot of problems. And I think historically there is an important measure of truth that Adam Smith pointed a path to wealth and wealth accumulation that was extremely pertinent, important, historically validated in its ways, though one shouldn't say a sentence like that without also acknowledging the unbelievable cruelty and violence that also was part and parcel of the capitalist system from the very start. But we knew already, and Adam Smith told us in Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations, some of the reasons why the invisible hand was limited. By the way, in the debates about Smith, about the meaning of that phrase and his views, I've also, I think, like many of us, been thinking long and hard and reading a lot about his use of the phrase, and I think it was really a religious phrase and a belief in providentialism of a self-ordered system, something like the solar system, but in the economic sphere. He recognized that it would not be so self-ordered in every dimension. So Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations is about various kinds of collective action, especially around primary education and infrastructure. But the gist of the book is not only a brilliant disquisition of trade, specialization, and the functioning of a market economy, but it is a claim that it is, by and large, a self-organized system that can function in a self-organized way. I think that this is less and less true of the problems that we have today, in part because of the successes also of wealth accumulation. Accumulation of wealth is not the major challenge of economic life in the 21st century, even when we regard the problems of development, because those problems are conceptually not hard to solve. They require different institutional approaches, but not conceptually hard to solve. So I think we're moving to a new kind of economy based on sustainable development, which is a term of art, not just a phrase. It's marked by more solidaristic institutions and a relative diminution of the role of market forces in allocation, in distribution, and in innovation, meaning that allocation of resources is much more through collective budgetary actions, for example. Distribution is much less based on market returns and much more based on a range of provisions and endowments. And innovation is relatively less the work of entrepreneurs and relatively more the work of systems of science and innovation, including our university. And my argument is that we have 6 major large-scale disruptors of the 21st century that are profoundly disruptive, and that the invisible hand cannot handle any of these adequately. Of course, this would require a long discussion, and I'm just touching briefly on these points, but so be it. First is the Anthropocene. The ecological crisis is extraordinarily severe. We know that every day from the reports of COP26, but not just that. We know that every day from the tumult in the world. It was the function of the Earth Institute in part to help Wally Broker and Jim Hansen get their message out, which is that the Earth systems are profoundly disrupted and reaching extraordinarily dangerous tipping points on many dimensions of climate, biodiversity, ecosystem functioning. And suffice it to say, we're in the midst of disruptions that are going to accelerate and have profoundly dangerous and devastating effects on large parts of the global population. We cannot solve these problems through market forces alone, though market forces will play some role when certain externalities are addressed, like the free dumping of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The solutions to these problems are far deeper and more systemic and cannot be solved by decentralized actions, even guided by prices. There are just too many market failures, too many scale economies, too many non-convexities, too much system planning. And we can't make a change of the energy system in 28 years by putting on a carbon price. It would help, but it would not come close to achieving what needs to be achieved. The second fundamental driver is geopolitical change. We're at the end of the US-led world, and we're at the end of the North Atlantic-led world. We're in a very different geopolitical environment now. We'll be lucky to avoid devastating war, but we will also face very different beliefs, organizational systems, and ways of managing the economy. Third, we're in multiple demographic changes, huge. Of course, we're at the end of the rapid growth of the world population, but we're not at the end of its consequences. So we are facing rapid aging in our part of the world. We are facing a still extraordinary growth of population in low-income countries, and notably in Africa. And we are facing another 3 billion people arriving in cities within the next 30 years. And these are a scale of change that is unprecedented and requires massive public policies. Fourth is the kind of, we have 100 years of experience of varieties of capitalism, and I would argue that the most successful of these have been the Northern European countries, and their success in universal provision of services has now resonated worldwide, meaning that the ideology of allocation is really changing rapidly. I see that in my work in the UN every day. There is absolutely an underlying social democratic ethos that is pervasive worldwide, though not in the United States, of course. We stand almost alone in this regard. Fifth is the speed of disruption from technology, which will change our lives even more than has been true in the past 40 years, but that's already been a huge change. I think the changes can be hugely beneficial, but they also require massive redistributive approaches. We will, if we're smart and lucky, eliminate vast numbers of jobs in the economy, vast amounts of working hours, increase leisure time massively. But for this to happen in a way that is even remotely equitable would require a tremendous political orientation. Again, the United States doesn't have it, but I'm coming back from Norway last week. If you want to see the future, it's a good place to have a look. They don't feel quite the angst we do because they're handling things in a very different way. But it's also a future of very different labor market structure, participation, and simply working hours. And finally, the point I would make is that we were, for arguably the 250 years since Adam Smith wrote, in the era of wealth, and the wealth of nations was a very smart and effective proposal to address chronic poverty. We are now in the aftermath of that age where increments of wealth are not in any reliable way incremental gains in well-being. And the urgency of wealth as opposed to other dimensions of our lives is diminished in good economic terms, diminishing returns to incremental wealth. And this also means that the institutional orientation will no longer focus on wealth accumulation the same way that it did in the past. So this leads, in my view, to a recognizable but different set of institutional priorities and ethical emphases. First is what I call social democratic distribution of services, the basic norm that everybody, every human being, receives educational services, social services, child care, health care, and so forth as a matter of social organization. As I think everyone here knows, we are the last high-income democracy to accomplish that. It's still viewed in a horrible way in the United States by the Wall Street Journal editorial page, let's say. But it is the norm in every other high-income democracy. And that's because it functions, it works, it creates social cohesion, it's efficient, it's lower cost in terms of resources, And so I think that this is a basic feature. Second, I think we will move to a regime of global fiscal sharing and financial sharing in a way that we never have before. This is very hard. This will no doubt take decades because even the European Union has an extraordinarily difficult time of redistributing even modest amounts across borders of a tight union. Doing this globally has never been accomplished, but I think that it is a part of the logic of the international strong interdependence that we will move in that direction. And one could even see the recent G20 agreement on tax and the 136 countries that have signed on to it as the opening of a new regime of tax cooperation. Because unlike trade, tax never had this kind of cooperation. It had treaties against double taxation, but basically not an international regime. But this is no longer tenable in such a tightly interconnected world. Third, for addressing the environmental and Anthropocene challenges, we must be in a period of substantial planning. Again, I apologize, this runs completely against the grain in the United States, but I was born in 1954, and in 1955 the Federal Highway Act was voted, and much of my childhood I recall the debates about whether the highway should run at 11-mile road or 12-mile road or 10-mile road in my neighborhood in Detroit. It was a planning issue. It was a land use issue. It was a political issue. It took 35 years. The United States built the highway system. It didn't just say, there's money, go build highways. This is a market activity. There was actually a map and a plan and a 35-year effort to do that. I would argue, and I would argue at great length, that we need the same for the energy system. There's no way that you build an energy system by saying, pay a carbon price and do what you want. No utility works that way. No power grid works that way. No energy system works that way. Since we are in a period unprecedentedly of forced, top-down, directed transformation, and we need to be for our physical safety, this requires a different kind of politics. And of course, we're almost incapable of it in this country right now. We have been 29 years without one vote in the US Senate for significant action on climate, and last week, Joe Manchin threw out the latest attempt as if nothing had happened in the past 29 years. But the rest of the world is behaving extraordinarily differently. I believe on the fourth point that we are moving to a very different kind of time use. Most of our discussion in the economics profession is about what kind of jobs will come next after the machines can do the current jobs. And I'm hoping that no new jobs will come next, but plenty of time at the coffee shop. That's my own hope. In other words, that we see these advances as an opportunity for leisure, for culture, for education, for care economy, for other uses of our time, rather than inventing new forms of drudgery. And I think for us in academia, a lot of that has already arrived, frankly, because the way we live our lives is very enriching. And it isn't drudgery, and I call it leisure. My wife doesn't like it when I characterize it that way. But I think that the nature of work will change tremendously, should. But if we continue as we are, it will not happen with the remotest equity. Because what's happened now is that the jobs, good jobs, are being eliminated massively, and a significant part of the population is therefore left with miserable jobs and with the market incomes that go along with that, whereas those who own these transformative technologies are reaching levels of wealth that were unimaginable just recently. So we need a designed idea. Again, other countries, this is second nature. Every country has guaranteed leave time. Every other high-income country works less than the United States by hundreds of hours, actually, in the case of Europe. And other countries rank higher on countless indicators of well-being, including asking people about their well-being. America ranks quite down the list compared to the measured well-being in basically the Northern European countries. And then finally is the question of entrepreneurship and science and industrial policy. There's a lot to say about this, and entrepreneurs certainly make a difference and play a difference, but we, I think, over-glamorize their role tremendously as opposed to the highly institutionalized, unbelievably productive era of science and technology that we're in right now. There's never been a golden age as we have right now of scientific advance. And you pick up any single weekly issue of Science or Nature, and it's mind-boggling how productive the global scientific community is. But it is a community, it's not individual entrepreneurs, it's systems. And we need to invest heavily in those systems in order to be able to find the solutions. The vaccines that we have did not come through one person's breakthrough. Indeed, we have dozens of people claiming it was their breakthrough, which proves that it was actually widespread systems, lots of clever people, lots of university research, especially at Penn, but also at other places. And this is the kind of role of science that we need for the challenges that we have. I have no crystal ball, except to say that none of these fundamental problems works in a disaggregated way. None of them stops at the national border. Ideas of disentangling or delinking from China are just mind-bogglingly wrong as well, perhaps understandable in our national angst or neuroses, but we are in an inevitably interconnected world that needs massive transformations in how we live, in how we interact with nature, in how we share the benefits of vast advances of technology. And all of that requires a collective action rather than the markets alone. Markets will play a role. I'm talking about a relative balance. And those are the reasons why I think we will describe the 21st century economy institutionally in a very different way. My time has expired. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Michelle Gelfand from Stanford. I'm a cross-cultural psychologist. I'll be talking tomorrow, and I'm just curious, a lot of what you're talking about reflects American values and norms. We're very well known to be vertically individualistic, which means we emphasize independence, but also competition. And we're very loose in terms of our social norms. And I'm just wondering what you think in terms of the requirements of culture change to really support these emerging new institutions.
Yes.
Because it seems to be left off of the sort of agenda when the fact is a lot of these changes can't happen without some significant culture change. For example, Norway and other Scandinavian cultures are individualistic, but they're more horizontal. There's much more solidarity and concern with other humans, even given the individualism. So I'm just curious about where culture fits into your emerging plan.
I think that what we have is a distinctively Anglo-American economics culture in the profession and in the global institutions that to a very significant extent were created during two imperial periods, the British Empire and the American Empire. And so we set terms that are distinctively Anglo-American in orientation. That is an evangelical Protestant individualism. It has some strong strains of Calvinism, although It's more a British form of Calvinism or English form, which is more individualistic than Calvin, certainly. But these became global cultural, not global culture, but they became embedded in global institutions because of the remarkable lopsided influence of the two countries. Britain dominated global change in the 19th century because it got to the steam engine first and all the other things that came with that. The United States, partly as a British offshoot and partly because of the American experience, took the baton in 1945 and shaped the international institutions thereafter. So it's long been understood our capitalism is very different from Roman Catholic capitalism of Southern Europe, from Lutheranism of Northern Europe, even though it's a kind of post-Lutheranism. And our culture is therefore an outlier. We don't understand that. We have a very strong evangelical streak to our culture. That is part of Protestant evangelicalism, which is not only do we have our culture, it's going to be your culture too, because it's the best culture. And after 200 years of world leadership, you feel very confident that that must be right. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had all of this providential gain. But it is not the culture of the rest of the world. And that's one of the reasons why I make these predictions, because the institutional, when we have tensions with China, these are very different cultures. It's not only different institutional or political arrangements, it's cultural arrangements. And when one looks, by the way, maybe another sentence on the shorthand, we've done miserably during COVID, in my opinion, other than the one good thing of coming up with vaccines, of the mRNA vaccines, which is a sign of a certain part of the economic design. The cultural qualities of the United States have been deadly, literally deadly. We've had more than 750,000 deaths. And this is a massive cultural failure. Not political failure, cultural failure. The fact that people get up and yell at healthcare workers, the fact that wearing a mask is viewed as an infringement of liberty is, well, it goes back to some very, very bad British ideas taken to wild extremes. So those same failures are the failures to deal with climate change, to deal with inequality. They have these deep cultural roots, and they are an outlier globally. Yeah.
Hi, Michael Massing. Thank you, Professor Sachs, for the relatively optimistic view that we're all headed toward a Norwegian-style social democracy. I hope that's true, but I don't know, I feel that maybe one thing left out is the power of financial capitalism. The whole world might be moving toward a more collectivist approach, but meanwhile, the financial sector, based in the US, but globally, is becoming more powerful, it seems to me. During the pandemic, I mean, the amount of wealth and power that private equity and hedge funds and alternative asset investors and the like has just soared. And it seems to me that that is, even China, you know, you find the same sort of drive going on. So does that conflict with the optimistic outlook that you have? And how is the power of the financial sector going to be restrained to allow these other elements to assert themselves?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question and a great topic. Certainly, globalization of capital movements in a world of nation states, vastly empowered capital to redefine the terms of the game. And in the last 30 or 40 years, a lot of privilege was earned by internationally mobile capital, and it created a system of enormously favorable tax treatment, regulatory treatment, hidden accounts, I mean, a complete system of shell companies and dummy companies that we're arguing about right now these hours in Congress because it's such a comfortable system for wealth accumulation and for tax breaks. So the question is, can that be constrained? Individual countries cannot constrain internationally mobile capital. Only a collective action could do that. And I think two things that I would note, or maybe three indicators in the wind. First, this tax regime discussion, to my mind, is something new. Not just negotiating a minimum tax, but even the ability to do it is a common understanding that we can't go on, even the United States, which likes to set all rules, we can't go on just in a Nash decentralized equilibrium of race to the bottom. So the fact that one could reach an agreement on some basics of the tax regime, and it's a weak agreement, but in our political environment, it's an agreement, which is amazing. That's one point that I would point to. Second, definitely within Europe, the financial sector is much more constrained because Europe is acting at a European-wide level, and there is more regulation. In fact, just these days, lots more regulation on climate to support the European Green Deal and so on. Third, China's different, and fascinatingly so. And I am not an expert of what's happened in the last weeks, and I haven't seen truly authoritative accounts. But the crackdowns in the financial sector in China, the crackdowns on cryptocurrencies, which to my mind is so shocking that we didn't do that years ago in the United States, and so bizarre that we have trillions of dollars of wealth in assets that have no wealth at all no value at all in my view, except negative value, either substituting for my currency, which I don't like, or facilitating illicit exchange, which I also don't like. China is taking a quite different view, which is government will regulate the economy. And of course, this is viewed in the American press as you see this horrible system. They're cracking down. They're even cracking down on gaming and addictions of young people. Isn't that horrible? Where's the freedom? They're cracking down on Bitcoin. Isn't that horrible? Well, probably not. Probably it is the kind of regulatory approach that we should have in the United States, but can't have anymore because in the U.S. Political system, money dominates government. So I think your question is the question, will the U.S. financial system dominate the global scene, or will there be increasing financial regulation introduced across the world? I guess the latter, but it's against the tendencies of the former over the past 40 years. Thank you very much.